really won't do that. Okay, I will introduce you.
Okay, great. Good evening, everyone. How are you all doing? Good. All right, let's have more energy. I know it is Friday. I'm also really exhausted, but let's have a little bit more energy. How's everybody doing?
Good!
I already feel so much better. Thank you. So I'm Darakshan. I'm with Justice for Muslims Collective. Both of us are really, really happy and glad to see all of you here. I want to thank Nicole and the GW folks for really giving us this beautiful room and access to it. So thank you so much for that work. And so with that, I'm going to introduce Dr. Maha Hilal. I'm going to read her bio. She is a genius, brilliant. That's just my introduction for her, and she's going to talk really about reclaiming Muslim rage. And I know this is definitely a pretty heavy topic. It's something that isn't necessarily as a Muslim in a public sphere. We're not allowed to actually even talk about this without the concern and worry about how we're being seen, perceived, because of the way Islamophobia has operated. So I'm going to read her incredible bio, and then she's going to give some remarks for us, and then we're going to have a discussion amongst us, which is what we wanted. So Dr. Maha Hilal is the co-director of Justice for Muslims Collective. She is the inaugural Michael Ratner Fellow with the Institute for Policy Studies in DC. She's also an organizer with Witness Against Torture. Concurrent with these roles, she's also a co-principal investigator with the Torture Treatment Initiative out in Tulane University's Traumatology Institute. She was previously the executive director of the National Coalition to Protect Civil Freedoms, an organization dedicated to addressing civil and human rights abuses related to preemptive prosecutions and thought crimes in the War on Terror. She earned her doctorate in May 2014 from the Department of Justice, Law, and Society at American University in Washington, D.C. The title of her dissertation is Too Damn Muslim to Be Trusted: The War on Terror and the Muslim American Response. She also has a master's degree in counseling and a bachelor's degree in sociology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She has worked at a number of human rights and social justice organizations, including the Center for Victims of Torture and National Religious Campaign Against Torture, a lot of anti-torture organizations, and the Government Accountability Project. And again, we're just really, really honored to have her be speaking here, and just really want to thank her for being bold and courageous to really touch issues publicly as a Muslim that I think many of us are very afraid to touch because of the retaliation that we can get from that. So thank you, Maha, for doing this, and I'm excited to hear it. So thank you, Darakshan, and thank you to all of you for being here tonight. I've prepared some remarks that I'm going to read, but what I want to introduce the remarks by saying is that, I frequently get told that I'm angry, particularly around my advocacy work on Guantanamo. And for me, it's never something that I shy away from, and it's something that I say, you're right, I am angry. I am angry that there's a prison that houses Muslim men. I am angry that there's a Muslim ban. I am angry that there are unwarranted drone attacks. So for me, this topic is really important to kind of dissect the way that Muslim rage is treated and presented and often used in the rhetoric of the War on Terror. I'm really excited to hear the remarks of Nicole, Darakshan, and Azza after my talk, and really get all of your thoughts on what this topic means to Muslims in the current context. So in September 2012, Newsweek published an article by Ayaan Hirsi Ali titled Muslim Rage: How I Survived It and How We Can End It. To supplement the article, the image on their monthly magazine was that of Muslims who looked angry, and without any context of the place or the context which they were protesting, the image was intentionally used to reiterate the trope of irrational Muslim rage. After publishing the article and photo, Newsweek then asked readers to use the hashtag Muslim Rage to discuss the cover. Many Muslims partook in critiquing the image and the premise that Muslims are enraged about everything all the time, while the counter-narrative that Muslims were embracing sought to deconstruct and dismantle the notion of irrational Muslim rage. What it didn't do was to acknowledge the existence of legitimate rage. And it is legitimate rage that has been denied to Muslims. Upon sending out a flyer with this very same image, but crossing out Newsweek and replacing it with the word reclaiming, a fellow Muslim wrote to me saying, "Is this a serious poster? It's really bad. The header, the images of angry Muslim men, etc. Act for America would be proud." From this interaction, I realized that there were two very different perceptions of what this picture was about and what, therefore, we should do with it. To me, the picture was about rage, legitimate rage, in response to state violence. To him, it seemed to be a picture we should hide, file away, and marginalize, because Muslims apparently must hide their rage from the external gaze. In other words, Muslims' emotions are supposed to be moderated by society's narrative of how we experience the world in terms of state and societal violence. Years earlier, in 2007, an image of a young Kashmiri man was captured at a protest, with his fist in the air and seemingly yelling. The photo went viral, and the young man in the photo, whose name no one seemed to know, was simply nicknamed Muslim Rage Boy. With his photo circulating around the world and photoshopped into many other Muslim protests, it would have seemed like a good time to understand why perhaps this young man seemed so angry. But providing context would have undercut the trope of the irrational, rageful Muslim. These images parallel the long-standing but never answered questions about why Muslims are so angry. Numerous articles, essays, shows, etc. have attempted to examine the so-called roots of Muslim rage. But thus far, no one seems to have succeeded in uncovering these roots. But that's because the source of the rage is not actually important. After all, it's not about an equation that can be solved if we just knew that one variable. Instead, the equation is already answered, regardless of what the missing variable actually is. The concept of reclaiming Muslim rage is therefore an attempt to deconstruct the narrative that upholds the notion of irrational anger, to understand the context from which this rage emerges, and to situate the purpose of gaslighting legitimate rage. This concept is also about dismantling an external system of Islamophobia that targets the Muslim community on the basis of this trope, and at the same time, undoing internalized Islamophobia that leads to Muslims' own inclination to disguise anger. The image of angry Muslims long precedes the 9/11 attacks, but helped usher in a set of policies under the umbrella of the War on Terror that distinctly targets Muslims. But before jumping into the current political landscape, it's important to understand a few key broad genealogies of the trope of Muslim rage. In 1990, Bernard Lewis wrote an article in The Atlantic titled "The Roots of Muslim Rage: Why So Many Muslims Deeply Resent the West and Why Their Bitterness Will Not Easily Be Qualified." In his essay, Lewis goes through a litany of reasons why Muslim rage might exist, including American support for hated regimes, racism, colonialism, and imperialism. But for each conceivable explanation of Muslim rage, Lewis has a counter-argument. American support for hated regimes isn't that frequent. The US is working on its racism, colonialism ended, and Muslims are only upset about imperialism because they are governed by infidels. If none of these things actually captures the roots of Muslim rage, then what does? By his logic, rage is inherent to Muslims, and what makes this rage doubly frightening to the external world is that it can't be explained and therefore addressed. A secondary corollary that follows is that if US policies are not actually to be blamed for Muslim rage, then we need not fix them. After all, Muslim rage is the problem, not state violence. Samuel Huntington's work titled "The Clash of Civilization," a term borrowed from Lewis, introduced a quasi-academic theory attempting to explain both the concept of civilization and an analysis of Islam's history, which apparently, unlike other civilizations, according to Huntington, has bloody borders. In Huntington's eyes, Islam and Muslims are a monolith of anger, and irrational anger at that. Despite the fact that Huntington's theory was widely critiqued and challenged, as Abrahamian wrote in 2011, paradigms do not have to be true to become conventional wisdom. And this is precisely the case when it comes to Huntington's work. The clash of civilizations in particular, whose language has been echoed and legitimated after 9/11 in order to sustain the narrative of an inherent clash between Islam and the West, and to subsequently justify policies that are exceptional in their brutality and abusiveness. As this logic follows, if Islam and Muslims are the problem, then civilizational rehabilitation is what is called for and necessary to addressing Muslim rage. While these two seminal pieces have shaped a large part of the discourse post 9/11, others building off the theory of Muslim rage emerged. This includes an article by Fareed Zakaria, who was a student of Huntington's, titled The politics of rage. Why do they hate us? The point of this article was twofold: to isolate Muslim responses to grievances and to double down on the theory of inherent Muslim rage. Like the others, the conclusion is that there really isn't an explicable reason for Muslim rage. Opining on Muslim rage post 9/11 didn't end there, and in 2002, Thomas Friedman took a stab at understanding Muslim rage, writing a piece called The Core of Muslim Rage. In it, Friedman writes, "I have long believed that it is poverty of dignity, not a poverty of money, that is behind a lot of Muslim rage today. And the reason this rage is sharpest among educated but frustrated Muslim youth. This is not to say that US policy is blameless. We do bad things sometimes. But why is it that only Muslims reacted to our bad policies with suicidal terrorism, not Mexicans or Chinese?" End quote. Put in these terms, Friedman is able to shrug off rage as a problem of dignity, while also isolating the Muslim response to violent acts of the US as unique. Never mind that he didn't go into the details of some of the, quote, bad things the US does, because that's not the problem. Characteristics inherent to Muslims are. These pieces are far from the only ones who are theoretically engaged in understanding so-called Muslim rage. But with each additional piece coming to the same conclusion, Muslim rage is inexplicable in its totality, then it logically follows that no one is responsible for triggering the conditions that led to that rage, much less implementing a solution that could ostensibly address their anger. Shifting to the current political context of the war on terror, the focus on Muslim rage serves two related purposes. One, to allow the US to posture concern for understanding its roots, though only insofar as its concerns justifies illegal and violent practices, and two, to absolve the US and other Western countries of any responsibility for actually addressing it. But since no one has yet to uncover the so-called roots of Muslim rage, let me offer some reflections here from the post-9/11 context. Muslims who grew up in the era of the war on terror probably remember what it felt like watching the TV screens when the 9/11 attacks happened. Well, we wondered if it was committed by Muslims and what it would mean for us, even though some of us were too young to have that feeling ingrained within us. On September 20th, days after the 9/11 attacks, former President Bush gave a speech, and in it he said that, quote, "Tonight we are a country awakened to danger and called to defend freedom. Our grief has turned to anger, and anger to resolution. Whether we bring our enemies to justice or bring justice to our enemies, justice will be done." But by justice, Bush meant for the nation state, not for the people who died on 9/11, nor the people, namely Muslims, who would be killed thereafter. He didn't mean justice for the 1.3 million Iraqis, Afghanis, and Pakistanis who died in the course of the war on terror, nor did he mean justice for Syria, a country whose civil war the US has continued to perpetuate to fight against an enemy it created. Nor was he speaking of justice for those imprisoned and tortured in Abu Ghraib, despite the sign that said, quote, "America is a friend of all Iraqi people," a sign that was put in place of Saddam Hussein's portrait at the prison's entry. Justice is not for those whose rage we don't understand. Justice is only for those whose humanity we can see, not whose humanity is constantly negotiated. And by those standards, justice was never meant for Muslims. That's why the US can continue to make false moral equivalencies between their actions and the actions of terrorists. The US's rage, after all, is righteous, but we don't call it that, and because it comes from the stiff hand of military might. The US's righteous rage means that it can define terrorism as limited actions by non-state actors to evade responsibility for terrorizing millions of Muslims around the world, because they leave behind collateral damage, not bodies or souls. Muslim rage kills, not the US's righteous rage, or so the fable goes. But let me be more explicit about why Muslim rage exists. Perhaps it's because of the global system of Islamophobia that dehumanizes and criminalizes Muslims. It might be because this global system has legitimized mistreatment and abuse of Muslims, not only by non-Muslims, but also by Muslims who've been colonized by the logic of the war on terror and the myth of Muslims' inherent terroristic tendencies. Perhaps it's because this system has led to detention, torture, and death. Or maybe it's because Muslim lives are unaccounted for, though maybe they never mattered in the first place. Perhaps it's about a Guantanamo prisoner who languishes in prison, remembering the time he was sold for a bounty as being the last time his life had value. Maybe Muslim rage is about prisoners at Guantanamo like Adnan Latif, who allegedly committed suicide after being cleared for release, writing to his attorney that, quote, "Anybody who is able to die will be able to achieve happiness for himself." Maybe it's rage caused by the realization that happiness for Muslims in the war on terror means death. Maybe it's rage from all the policies ushered in under the war on terror that include the National Special Entry Exit Registration System, the Patriot Act, and material support for terrorism laws, and state-sanctioned torture and abuse that have created a permanent state of fear for Muslims, whether in the form of immigration barriers, the stripping of free speech rights, and the protection against bodily harm. Or perhaps Muslim rage is motivated by policies such as the Muslim ban that prevents their entry into the United States because Muslims should be held collectively responsible. Terrorism, after all, is not a crime committed by a distinct set of actors, but rather the entire community of adherents to Islam. Perhaps Muslims rage because of violent policies like the authorization of the use of military force that allows the US to treat the world as its battlefield, a battlefield that has extended into Somalia, Yemen, and Pakistan. Or maybe it's because Anwar al-Awlaki, a Muslim American citizen, was extrajudicially assassinated only to have his son follow him to the grave 3 weeks later with the sharp words of an American government official saying that the 16-year-old should have had a more responsible father. Maybe it's rage brought about because Muslims are treated as second-class citizens while the US destroys the countries that some call home. Maybe it's because belonging to a country, whether the US or another, is mediated by state violence domestically and abroad. Could it be that Muslims also rage because the United States claims to be a country bound by the rule of law, though the only thing it seems bound by is scapegoating Muslims for domination and control? And maybe, just maybe, it's for all the ways Muslims have been demonized, criminalized, and oppressed, descriptions that would line a million pages. Perhaps none of these reasons satisfy those who eagerly wait on the sidelines for another act of Muslim violence, one that will allow them to claim that Muslims are as they said they were, rageful and violent, with no explanation. Because their task is not to examine state violence, it is to find reasons why state violence must be used. But this is what reclaiming rage is all about. The belief that Muslims have legitimate anger about all the ways their humanity has been denied, about all the times they had to resist repression from state violence, and all the times they have and continue to face a precarious existence, because it's easier to believe Muslims are irrational than that their rights have been violated. Reclaiming Muslim rage is about rising up, embracing our power, and fighting back with our truths. Our task is to contextualize our rage, not to deny it out of fear from the external gaze. Our task is not to acquiesce to these narratives or tropes. Our task is to tell our truths, because our truths, not theirs, will set us free. Thank you.
Woo!
Okay, so Darakshan, Nicole, and Azza, do you want to come up? You sit here in the front. So, Azza, do you want to start us off?
I can help.
How long as long as you want.
So I want to start by taking a moment to uplift the Native American communities whose stolen lands we are on currently. So
people can
I'm
actually
Azza
hear.
Altiraifi, and I am an organizer. And talking about rage is something that I do quite a bit. And for many of the reasons that Maha just articulated, but as a Black Muslim, the concept of rage is one that has a lot of resonance to me, because it is rage that has pushed us to fight and to organize and to secure what rights we have now and to continue the movement for collective liberation. And Maha gave us a really great picture of a lot of the historical narratives that have brought us to the point that we're at now. And I want to supplement that by talking a little bit about how this isn't an accident, that this is by design, and that structural Islamophobia didn't just appear, but it is part and parcel of a broader structure of white supremacy that is absolutely and totally inextricable from the systems of ableism and capitalism that support it. So said another way, you can't have white supremacy if you don't also have capitalism and ableism, which I would define as a system that devalues and dehumanizes bodies and minds that are seen as deviant and not normal. And so I want to talk a little bit about how the United States has historically constructed whiteness in particular ways. And those normative constructions of whiteness have always been exclusionary. They have always been designed in such a way as to ascribe value to certain people at the expense of others. And so what we're seeing happening to Muslim communities across the globe is nothing new. It's just a new iteration of a very, very long system of dehumanization. And so to start in understanding kind of more fully that picture, I think the first thing we need to understand is what is the role of capitalism in this? Because as Maha was talking, my mind kept coming to the fact that the reason why so much of this still stays so deeply entrenched is because what the United States did historically, and since we're here in the law school, I'm gonna put my undergraduate law degree hat on. But the reason why we are where we are is that historically speaking in the United States, what we saw was a multi-class coalition of people who were subject to maltreatment in a myriad ways. You had workers whose wages were withheld. You had slaves who obviously were working in terrible conditions. And you had people working together, and a lot of the rebellions that we know of today were rebellions that included communities that were diverse. And what ended up happening, what followed from that, is a movement at the top parts of society to be like, this is bad. We can't have all disenfranchised and poor communities angry at those at the top because that's the majority of people in the American colonies today. And so you have in the House of Burgesses in Virginia, the worst state in the Union, and I can say that because it's my home state, people talking about what does it mean to be white? What is the definition of whiteness? So we can literally pinpoint to a day in American history when whiteness becomes an actual legal construction. When that happened, what we also saw was that you have disrupted this multi-class coalition of people who were angry and resentful of all of the power being concentrated at the very top. And what that means for us today is that the reason why we have a bunch of people who are voting for Republicans despite the fact that their health care is being stripped from them, despite the fact that they're not getting anything out of it, they're not going to get jobs, coal industry is not coming back, and that they can still really believe that the reason why they're in the situation that they are is because Muslims are scary and terroristic and Black people stole their jobs and the immigrants came and took everything else. The reason they can believe that is because this is a centuries-long project of convincing people that the reason why they are stuck where they are is because of people who don't fit these normative constructions of whiteness. And normative constructions of whiteness is also tied to ability, because your construction of whiteness means you have value, and you only have value if you can produce. If you cannot produce, you are not valuable. And this is why ableism is so deeply entrenched in the system of white supremacy. And so all you have to do then is convince poor white communities that, hey, you know what? You are white and therefore you still have it a little better than that Black neighbor you have over there. And so you convince an entire community of people that despite the fact that functionally they really don't have that much because they have more just by virtue of being within the normative construction of whiteness, they're good. And you can have them participate in this broader system of white supremacy that actually also ends up taking from them too, because it is designed to concentrate power and wealth at the top. So how does this tie in then to a discussion of rage? Well, rage by its very nature will disrupt that system. You can't have people be angry. And if they are angry, fine, but it definitely can't be painted as legitimate. And we have seen this because historically, the state apparatus has been a police state that has targeted Black and Indigenous organizing since this country's inception and before it. It is a white supremacist state built on colonized and stolen lands, on the genocide of natives and the enslaved bodies of people stolen from the continent and brought here. You cannot let people be angry then, because if they are, it will disrupt those systems. And so you have entire structures built to support that. And so you have a system of mass incarceration that is a Muslim issue. You have a system in which healthcare is stripped from millions. That is a Muslim issue. You have a system that has targeted people on the basis of their faith, and that goes to not only within the context of Islamophobia here within the United States, but it goes to international conversations about what it means to be a terrorist and what it means to be terroristic, such that the entire study of terrorism necessitates a conversation about the fact that scholarship agrees terrorism can only be conducted by non-state actors. If that is true, then functionally, whatever the hell the US does, even though the US is a rogue state, whatever it does cannot be terroristic because it is the power majority, because the concentration of power exists within the US. And so until we understand that these narratives are shaped in such a way as to try and separate these systems out, to try and divide and conquer, because it worked so effectively at the country's inception, it is then imperative that we not just use intersectionality as that cool hip word that means that we're like good organizers now, but as a system that is specifically designed to connect our struggles with the understanding that they're trying to disconnect them to keep us from being successful in our movements for collective liberation. So we have to keep that kind of anchor our conversation in that understanding, because without that, we won't be able to fully understand why we are where we are today and then what it looks like to move forward. So I'll leave it there, and then I guess we can maybe talk more if anything was unclear in questions.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Peace be unto you. I'm going to talk a little bit about my own personal experiences when it comes to reclaiming rage, because it's something that I'm still coming into as of this week. I'd say it's always, it's a journey. I think living in this society, existing at the intersections of many identities, means that there's going to be that necessary constant growth, that constant reflection, that constant having to examine parts of your soul that really need taking care of. But I'm going to rewind it a little bit because we're coming on the 3rd anniversary of the Chapel Hill shooting. And for those of you who may or may not be familiar, in Chapel Hill, February 10th, 2015, our community lost Dia, Yusur, and Razan. They were young folks in our community. And I was a student at UNC Chapel Hill at the time. I was a senior, and I'm not even gonna pretend to have been like their best friend or whatnot. We were in the same communities. But there was something about just being in Chapel Hill at that time and it changing your world. I remember where I was, who I was talking to when, you know, a friend of mine got a text saying that Dia had been shot. And it's just like just pure disbelief. And so that kind of, at least for me personally, experiencing that range of emotion, like I didn't know how to deal. And a lot of folks in, you know, the greater community just didn't know how to deal with it. So folks were obviously very upset. There were folks who were confused. I was very confused. I was angry. And that's one emotion that kept with me for a really long time. And is still with me because, I mean, as we've been discussing, and that has been so eloquently and astutely pointed out by the sisters that came before, it's like anger is a part of our existence. And so I remember not too long after the shooting, I had a professor that pulled me aside, and she literally told me that she didn't believe it was a hate crime. Yeah, like that really happened. And it's just like, how could you not be angry?
Mm-hmm.
How could you not be angry when we have entire sectors of our society constantly dehumanizing the struggles that make up our lives? And for a really long time, for like the next 2 years, 3 years, like just unsure as to how to deal with that anger. Because when I would talk to an imam or whatever the case was, you know, like I'm angry, like I'm really upset. Like, oh, you know, sister, you know, we shouldn't be angry.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we need to, you know, like people like just saying, oh, well, you shouldn't be walking around with a chip on your shoulder, you know, constantly delegitimizing that anger that is a very natural response to our existence. And I'll have to say, like, it really wasn't until like I got involved with a lot of the work that's happening here that I had a level of introspection to be able to take ownership of that anger. Because for so long, I had just been told, okay, you need to find out and figure out a way to stop being angry. It's unhealthy, it's not productive, you know, all of these similar arguments that we hear. But at least when coming into what it means to be angry, I think it's also about taking that energy and making something of it, you know? And so at least where I'm at in my life, you know, in law school, it's like I'm always in the library, to be honest, and it's really doing too much. But one thing that is actually keeping me sane is getting angry. Because that's what's keeping me connected to the work that I know that I want to do. And so I'm really grateful for spaces like this where we can actually have a legitimizing conversation of the emotions that we have and the legitimacy that it entails, and how state violence against our communities is a real reality that plays into why we have these very real emotions, and why it's almost necessary to feel this in order to keep fighting. And for that, I think at least telling myself first, or advising myself first, is that it's okay to be angry. It's necessary to be angry. It's necessary to have a reserve, a repertoire of that energy that you tap into, that doesn't allow you to forget why you're on this earth and why we're trying to do the work that we're doing. Because as the amazing sister said before us, we're here to combat this state violence. We're here to combat the racism. We're here to combat the ableism. We're here to combat the Islamophobia. And we need that reserve. We need those repertoires of energy that's going to keep propelling us forward. And that's why I really appreciate spaces like this, where we can have honest deconstructive conversations that are really critical of how our society operates. And at least moving forward for me, like, I'm not gonna delegitimize my anger anymore, because I am hella angry. I am pissed. Like, it is, you know, I'm the type of person who is like, it's either I laugh or I cry. So
Now you can start fires.
yeah, start the fires. But I think, at least for me, it's my journey is going to be about how to really be constructive with that anger that I have. And I really appreciate this space, and I appreciate the opportunity to share my thoughts and my trajectory.
Thank you.
So I'm going to be really brief because Azza, Maha, and Nicole are just mashallah brilliant, and it's just so beautiful to hear you all three. I think for me, when I think about the term reclaiming Muslim rage, I've been thinking a lot about what does it mean to reclaim Muslim rage as a Muslim woman, particularly in the context of being South Asian, and having to feel like I'm raging against not only a state structural system that dehumanizes my Muslimness, but also my femness and my womanhood. That in a system of patriarchy is doubly under attack, not just from non-Muslims, but also, unfortunately, Muslim communities. And what does it look like to exist when the dominant construction of Muslim women under Islamophobia is that we are inherently oppressed, hence we don't even have any image of Muslim women's rage. The idea is you're just behind closed doors, only men have a right to that rage. And what does it mean then in a public sphere around political resistance when men's images of anger towards the state are normalized and accepted from the community, at least certain parts of our community, but women's isn't? So many instances, for example, if I'm at a bullhorn or I'm chanting loud, it feels like the crowd is not comfortable with that. They're more comfortable with a man being angry and upset about the system, but when a sister does it, there's something very uncomfortable about that. So I've been thinking a lot about that in my mind. The second thing I've been thinking about is the power of reclaiming rage. In systems that are basically gaslighting us. You know, I sort of, not to equate it, but there's some parallels to how abuse and domestic violence happen, where the abuser is able to gain power by basically telling you that your normal response as a human being to being violated, that there's an internal gut response. You don't even need to necessarily communicate it in language. It's there. And it's that rage of saying, not just even saying, but embodying that this is viscerally wrong, what is happening. And so in that context, when you are told, and someone is literally systemically telling you, not just the abuser, but society broadly, that message of, why are you so angry? You know, this is something you should have expected, or you did this, you caused it. Too often that is what you hear. When you talk about, for example, anytime you think about the ways Muslim communities, not even post 9/11, but I mean, we're talking about communities that have been under the colonial rule of white supremacy for centuries. That's a lot of historical trauma and pain that all of us are carrying. And again, not to equate all of our struggles because there are unique experiences in there, but we're coming from generations of having to resist really horrendous sort of systems of dehumanization. You know, I think about in my context of being Pakistani, I know my grandparents used to share the experience of what it felt like for them to live under the British rule, where as a brown person, you had to salute a white person that you saw. If you didn't, you would be executed in front of the entire market if you didn't do something like that. So, and that is in their own homelands. This is not as if, you know, so, as somebody who wasn't born in the US, I think about, again, just my relationship where I'm told, go back, you know, this is not your country. But white supremacy didn't really care about proximity or location. It's global in that context. So I've been thinking a lot about how reclaiming and recognizing your rage, and I think it's a multi-level process, as Nicole said. There's one of you in your own intimate private space that you do it, because sometimes it's very
scary to do it publicly. I mean, even when we were doing this event, I was just joking with Maha. I was like, I wonder if the FBI is surveilling this room right now.
They are.
Or do we have to think about an informant that might be in this space, right? And just those dangers of even if we try to have this conversation about what is the risk that we're running for people who are going to be coming into the space, or for ourselves even, given how broadly this war on terror has looked at things like extremism or radicalization, where they look at a Muslim reclaiming their rage as a precursor to being a terrorist. And we know that for many members of our community, that is where the fear comes from, of publicly not ever wanting to talk and claim their anger, because it's like, am I gonna now put myself out there a little bit more that can now incur more violence towards me and my community and my family? So I've been thinking about that a lot, but also just that there is something natural in you that maybe we can't even necessarily put into words, but it tells you that the situation and condition that you are in is absolutely not livable and doable. And your inner self is saying to you, I can't survive this. I am angry, I am upset for a reason. And that if we are allowed some space to cultivate that, that is really the pre-step to all this organizing and resistance and community building and self-work and political education. I mean, that's really at the root cause of it. And so how beneficial for our oppressors to literally make us hate the rage in us and say, we are responsible for what we're doing, clearly. So just quick thoughts.
Does anyone have questions or points of discussion?
Can I ask you guys a question? How many of you are law students?
That's
Nice.
amazing.
How many of you law students are familiar with the case of John Punch, 1640, in the Commonwealth of Virginia? Okay, so for you guys, I'm gonna give you homework. Look up that case. It speaks directly to what I was talking about, and I feel like I always tell people to read about it, because I feel like if you want to understand white supremacy and how insidious and well designed it was, you need to understand what happened there, because that was a case in 1640 in which you have an African indentured servant and a Scotsman and a Dutchman, I think, and they all escaped their indentured servitude. And for the first time codified in American history, you have the judge, after they're captured, telling the Scotsman and the Dutchman, all right, you guys get 5 years of labor and you won't be compensated for it, and the first few years will be to your master and the last to the colony. And then he tells the African indentured servant, you will labor without pay for the rest of your days for the colony. And this is the first codification of it. And this was the first process of disrupting what I was talking about earlier, that this kind of movement recognizing that the power distribution in the colonies was not one that was fair. And that goes on till today. And when I talk about mass incarceration, I realized I didn't share something of my own story that I kind of want to share now, because what you said really resonated with me in a very deep and visceral way. Because anger isn't just like the thing that keeps me going. It is literally the reason why I'm alive. Like literally the reason why I'm alive. I am a psychiatrically disabled individual. I have been institutionalized against my will at least 5 times because of it. And if I wasn't angry, I would not be here. So anger isn't just a means to kind of give yourself to the movement. It is literally how we can continue to thrive and live in a system that is designed to destroy us. And so I feel like I wanted to amplify that from what I was hearing from you, because that's definitely been my experience too. All right, Maha, come up with a discussion question.
Before we move forward, can we just do 2 deep breaths? Because this is very heavy stuff. Okay.
So I'm just curious if any of you who are in the audience have any thoughts about what you heard. Does it resonate? Does it not resonate? I know that there's, I think to some extent we all talked about like the internalization of rage and having worked in the Muslim community for, quite some time now, just really seeing how that's manifested and trying to think of ways to like deconstruct it. So I'm just curious if you all have thoughts on that.
So I think this is like the first time I'm hearing about the term Muslim rage. I never really knew what it meant. I think Maha, you tried to describe it to me once over email. But I think it makes a lot of sense. I think what you guys are talking about how like, Muslim rage is there. We might not feel it because maybe we've had to suppress it and like we don't fully understand it. So right now at this moment, I'm not really sure how I relate to it. Like if I have Muslim rage, if I don't. And it might be because of the things that you all described. But what I was also thinking about was right now, like I'm a 1L, and so like I got to choose one elective this semester, and I chose a class on national security and human rights. And when I saw the title of that course, I was like, national security and human rights. Like I feel like those two are opposites. But I want to take it. I want to see what this is about. And it's so interesting because like when I sit in that class, it's only been like 3 classes so far, but the way that they talk about what the U.S. is doing abroad, it's always in a way that like legitimizes what the U.S. is doing, right? And like the professor, people say really great things about him, like maybe he is like a really learned person, and maybe he is. But like I guess in that situation, I'm not even sure what to say. Like I know that what the U.S. is doing is wrong. Like I get that. I feel like a lot of people like know objectively that it's wrong, but it's just I think I need to learn how to better like counter those arguments that they're telling us. Because it's not enough for the professor to just say, yeah, AUMF like it authorized the president to do all these things in those countries, and yep, now the end. Let's go to the next topic. Like I think in the class we should be talking about that's really not okay. Like, do you realize what that means? That the president has the power to do that? Like, do you realize the consequences of that? And like we don't talk about that stuff. We just talk about whether it's constitutional, right? Like, I don't know. Is it relevant if it's constitutional? Like, I don't know. And I don't think it is. Like, what's the Constitution? So, I just think it's a really interesting topic to think about, especially now where, personally, I'm taking constitutional law and this class. So, I don't really know what the Constitution is or why it's so important, but thinking about the two things together.
The Constitution is the document that made everyone here's rights an amendment and not an actual foundational part of the text. I'd start there.
That's a scripture of the country, right?
Yeah.
It's still a religious text in some way. It's true. We're really surprised.
No.
Thank you
Thank
for
you for
coming
coming.
here,
really
ladies.
appreciate the discussion, and I really appreciate you guys sharing your experiences.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. And so when I was doing my PhD, we studied more like the theory of justice and like jurisprudence and not the actual laws, although I ended up doing a little bit of that in my actual dissertation. But I mean, it also comes back to like the rule of law. Like, what does the rule of law mean if you can just create new laws to sanction otherwise illegal behavior? And that's what, that's how the war on terror was built, right? It's like, oh, something's not legal. Let's find a way to make it legal. And so what does that say about the rule of law? What does that say about the Constitution? And also when you're thinking along those lines, I mean, then there's really no sense of accountability. And I think that that's what we've seen across the board when it comes to the war on terror, right? There's no drone victim who's ever going to see their day in court for a family member who's been murdered, right? There's no Guantanamo survivor that's going to get reparations or compensation for what has happened to them. And so I think that, I mean, when we talk about these ideals of American justice, of the rule of law and democracy and all this, and that makes us superior, it's really hard to believe in those values. It's really, really hard. And I can't say that I do, right? And we can think about the instances in which it has worked, but it's not on a systemic level. And I think that that's what we keep seeing over and over again. And if I ever go to law school, I'll probably have a really hard time, honestly. Well, we can end now, unless you guys have any questions up here.
Do you have any closing thoughts?
I mean, I could talk about this for ages, so I'm not gonna other people.
Yeah, I'll just kind of echo what Sabia is saying as well. This week in my democracy and coercion course, we were talking about homeschooling. And, whether or not the state should have the ability to determine if a parent can or cannot homeschool. And just generally speaking, I had the privilege of speaking with a woman who took her child out of the school system because of, state violence that takes place within public schools and, CVE monitoring and whatnot. And so then after learning this, I was able to share that perspective, like just generally, in class as to how state violence is a problem and perhaps could even be a legitimizing force as to why like homeschooling could be an option for some certain groups of people. So I don't know, I feel like especially within the law school setting, it's really difficult to be able to, it's a very intimidating environment to actually be able to speak out against a lot of what is being said, because that is the law and that this is the rule of law. If you don't believe in it, then why are you here? Those types of ideas. But I think for me, my goal is to shake it up, I mean, that's like the only option that we do have, at least with the limited power that we have as a student who pays tuition. They have to call on us when we raise our hands, or even when we don't raise our hands, they're still going to call on us. But I think, and it actually felt like really empowering to be like, well, no state violence, legitimizing homeschool. Well, here, so I feel like, there could be a level of also like empowerment in like forcing ourselves in those types of spaces where it's like, where it's very controlled to a certain degree, like just, so I really appreciated that. But I feel you, Sabia, like it's just, I think that was the first time I even spoke like all year, but.
I think I see a hand in the back. Yeah, I wasn't sure.
I'll just see it through the crowd.
Sorry.
No,
I'm also
please.
1L, and yeah, it's extremely exhausting. Semester we have property every minute in that class. Exhausting. And hearing all of you speak about rage, about reclaiming it, about why it's important was very good for me to hear, especially because I've been thinking about that a lot, about how, I mean, I just had a conversation with another friend who's in law school yesterday about how I don't want to emerge from this somebody I didn't intend on becoming, because it's hard to pinpoint, but I feel like the system is directing you in a very specific way, and that's not what I wanted, that's not what I came here for. And so, like, I think having these conversations is just really important, because it reminds you why you even came here. Not like because you believe in the law, but because it's useful to be able to use it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That resonated with me too. I'm not in school, I'm working in the most exhausting space on the planet, Georgetown. That's a different conversation. But I say it because one of the things that's come up when I've spoken to people about how exhausting and draining it is to have to navigate a system that's not designed for you, is people are like, well, self-care. And I'm like, okay, well, first of all, your understanding of self-care is very capitalistic. I don't have that money. I can't be like spa day whenever I'm stressed. But more importantly, I think it's this really interesting thing. It's this really interesting thing of like, even caring for yourself and your well-being, like the state's putting that back on you and people are putting that back on you. So this institution is like, well, we are going to give you this inhuman workload. We're going to expect you to succeed despite the fact that you're not going to have access to the same resources that your other privileged counterparts have. And you're supposed to do it well, and you're supposed to be quiet, and then you're supposed to graduate and go on and be an attorney and be successful and make GW look good, and we'll start sending you mail asking for donations and stuff. And that's ridiculous. And I think that our organizing spaces then have a responsibility to not just advocate for self-care, but create community and collective care. And those resources do need to be made available. And that literally just looks like checking in on people. How are you? What's going on with you? And creating spaces where we can have honest and robust conversations about the toll that this takes on us, and finding ways to engage all of these issues and your workload and your internships and all of the millions of things that come up when you're doing law school or grad school or anything, to be able to handle those things in a way where you're not having to sacrifice your just general physical, emotional, and mental well-being to do it. Because being well is in itself a really radical form of resistance. Like, being well in a system that wants you to be unwell is one of the most powerful forms of resistance you can engage in. So I feel that to my core, because it's often really easy for me to lose sight of that too when I'm just like stuck in the daily drudgery that is Georgetown. But it's empowering then to remember that when I leave and I'm still okay and I'm still here, like, damn, I just did that despite the entire force of white supremacy, capitalism, ableism, and cis heteropatriarchy. Like, I'm Superwoman, and not the Israel apologist kind, like the cool kind. So that's really exciting, and that's something we should uplift in each other, I think.
It sometimes feels like the system's trying to keep you busy somehow, like you're
Distracted.
you know, like I want to get involved in like local things, but I never have the time. And I'm like, why is that though? You know, why do they make me not only so busy that I can't do other things, but like make me, you know, put the fear of God in me that if I don't do what they're telling me to, I'm not going to succeed.
Right.
And so it's really coercive and awful.
Sure. What are the types of things that you feel would help empower you and people who are in similar positions who feel like the system's just keeping you super busy and you can't take a breath? I feel like, you know, sometimes we don't feel comfortable necessarily asking for like, hey, this is what I need. I'm speaking for me right now. I definitely don't. And then I'm like, oh my God, this is really bad. I should have asked for help a long time ago. So if you're comfortable, maybe you could share, and if not, maybe others here can share what support would look like. What does good support look like? Support that enables us to be angry and not feel guilty for it, but also to feel well when your university or your job or whatever might not care too much.
I think right now, I think that getting into tough when you're new to the area and you don't know where to start and look. And I think also sometimes I feel restless, wasting my time on these books, and that, you know, I don't want to be sitting in a theoretical bubble. I want to be interacting with people and connecting with people who have similar struggles, or, you know, and so it might sound weird, but yeah, I'm just looking for spaces, like organizing spaces that I can go to.
Going along with that, I think being able to work together on something, or like out of your normal schedule, and just like have another like goal, right? Or like a space where you can come together like once a week or whatever, that and you actually work towards a tangible goal instead of just like all the theory stuff, or like things that maybe as a student you don't have the power yet to do.
Yeah.
Instead of sitting in that space, I'm just waiting to graduate, get the degree so I can actually do something. And maybe like working, you know, like
So I've been meaning to plug this in, but first of all, I'm really excited that there are a bunch of Muslim women becoming lawyers. We need really solid lawyers in the Muslim community. So kudos to you all. I do want to plug JMC's work that we're doing in the community right now. So one, there is a Muslim women's wellness space that we've created every single month that happens. So get on our list. It happens right around here in Adams Morgan, Columbia Heights, so it won't be a major trek for you if you're in this area. And that's, you know, things from physical self-defense, learning that, to yoga, body work, coloring. It's just a space with other Muslim women where you just kind of come for 2 hours, eat a couple of snacks, kind of do something physical. I think part of it is finding community. So I'd love to invite any of you to be a part of that. If you're also interested around community organizing piece, I've been talking to actually Nicole about this more. JMC would like to do like sort of a needs assessment of the Muslim community in DC, Montgomery County, and Northern Virginia. So we would love to have any like support around the research aspect of it or writing it. And again, I think as law school students, like you have those skills. If you're interested, there is definitely like interviewing components to it, kind of community mapping. So if you're like interested in getting into the local side of particularly building Muslim power around here, Nicole, you can talk to me and Nicole, but Nicole will be working with me pretty heavily around that. So again, if you have any time, it's, you know, love to sort of plug you guys into that work. So I do want to offer those two things. The third thing that is coming up where the applications will go up in a few months, not yet because we want to be intentional about building this, is JMC wants to do a Muslim Women's Organizing Institute. So what that would be is we would take 6 to 7 Muslim women in the DMV area who would commit to basically doing work in the DMV. So doing something, whether it's a know your rights training, whether it's some kind of, you know, educating, political education, something. So we will put applications out if any of you are interested in that as well. You know, that's another route to also get involved. So I just wanted to offer the 3 different things that, and also just follow us on social media and Facebook, because we will definitely be doing a lot of these kind of events. So for any of you who are like, how do we enter, you know, get connected to local organizing, particularly if you're interested in like Muslim communities, we're definitely here. So just wanted to let you guys know that.
Well, thank you all for coming.